Hi, I'm Nick, and this is Lemmy, and we're here to talk about catalytic converters, how they fail, and what you might want to do before you go ahead and replace them.
That's right, buddy. You know as well as I do that when you diagnosing a catalytic converter can range anywhere from total cakewalk to a little bit messy.
Yep.
Nick and I have done a couple of these over the years, and obviously you guys have done a ton too. We thought we would kind of drop some of our tips and tricks and/or thoughts.
What would be your first initial, telltale signs that you need a catalytic converter?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it because I feel like we talked about easy to hard, right? So the easiest one is like when I get under a car and it's super duper loud when I'm pulling it into the bay, and then I stare up there and the catalytic converter has clearly been cut out of the thing with a Sawzall.
Yep.
I feel super confident in that diagnosis.
Pretty common nowadays, isn't it?
Yeah. How about you? What's your go-to easy one?
I mean, probably the most common way that I know a cat is bad when I smell that rotten egg smell.
Ah, yes, the car fart. That is like, we're joking, but that is a very unique smell. There's not many times that a car smells like rotten eggs. That's usually a pretty good
The only other
indicator.
time would be a battery, probably.
Yep, that can also get that stink. But yeah, for the most part, that rotten egg smell, that's an easy one.
A cat.
And I think there's some other little mechanical failures that get kind of easy too. I mean, sometimes you'll hear that weird rattle in an exhaust. Sounds like a heat shield, but it's not a heat shield. It's a good substrate may have failed.
And usually when that happens, you can go to the tailpipe and see that there's not a lot of flow coming out of there, and usually means that rattle is a piece of cat that rotated and is reducing flow to the exhaust.
Those are the gimme putts, I think, in the world of catalytic converter replacement. But the reality is there's another driver, I think probably the second most common, other than staring up under there and not seeing a catalytic converter, and that is the dreaded PO 420.
Or 430.
Or 430, or 421.
431.
Or 431. We should probably talk about what all of those mean too. So
a 420 is going to be your cat efficiency below threshold. So, cat efficiency is low. It's worded differently with all manufacturers, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah, agree. And there's, of course, some related ones. So 420 is bank one, right? So you're going to see that one probably most often because a good portion of the cars we work on are 4-cylinder cars, and there's obviously only one bank. But if you see a 430, it's a bank two if you're on a V6 or a V8 or even bigger V10 vehicle. And then, of course, you've got the corresponding codes, 421, 431, and those are pre-cat codes. I think it's important to mention those because those are, they're 4 different codes, but they're also helping you figure out which one of those items
absolutely
may have gone wrong.
Yep. Yeah, a good tech is not going to replace parts based on the code itself. They're going to do some further diagnosis because the code is simply just a direction to go for diagnosis.
I think it's also important to mention too, like what that is telling you is this piece of the car is not operating correctly. It might be operating correctly if we fix some other problem. There really are a lot of people who just stab a converter into it and try and move on with life, and it's like that's probably not the way to do this.
Right, and then end up with the same failure and thinking that the part that they installed is subpar or not working, and they really haven't even addressed the root cause of the issue.
The catalytic converter from the factory, right, that has the longest warranty of almost any piece on the car.
Yep.
They're pretty rugged units. They last quite a while. So if the magic computer is telling me, oh, you got to replace this thing, it usually lasts forever. I don't know, man. The hair on the back of my neck stands up a little bit.
Especially because it's a really expensive part too. So you want to kind of isolate another issue if there is one, or the cause of why it went bad before you replace it. Another important thing that's kind of off topic to think about is when you have a problem with your catalytic converter, look at what you previously did. If you recently did an engine and the cause of the failure of the engine was a head gasket, you could have likely wiped out your catalytic converter because of that. And if you don't address that, you're going to end up with excessive back pressure and potentially blowing your head gasket again.
That is A, an excellent point. B, I don't think it's off topic in the slightest. I have also seen too, RTV silicone poison some cats. You'll see somebody goobering that stuff in there when they're doing an exhaust repair or something. I don't think that's off topic at all. I think that's actually a pretty good point. Sometimes those things that we think are unrelated really do play in. And I don't know about you, but if I'm doing something and then something else goes wrong, I usually go back to the thing I did. I'm pretty bad at fixing stuff sometimes. It's been my experience. reasonably rare to get just a converter efficiency code. There's oftentimes something else traveling with that code. Those codes come in pairs, right? Like, and sometimes
A lot of
triplets,
times they do.
yeah, you get some other stuff. And at least for me personally, if I see, a smorgasbord of codes, right? It's, we're just, nothing but codes. The converter efficiency code is one I'm gonna fix almost last, because that thing's so far downstream. It's almost the last thing that's monitored on the car, if not the last.
It's usually something that comes up because of another failure. You could have O2 sensor codes that come along with the 420, and you obviously want to dig a little deeper into that and try and make sure that your voltages are correct on your primary and secondary O2 sensors and compare the two. They should be between like 0.1 and a 0.9 volts if they're operating properly. So if you see that, then you can kind of move on, and if you don't, you probably have a problem in the O2 circuit. And like other wear and tear items that see a lot of heat, you're probably going to need to replace those. That would probably be my first go-to before I'm actually replacing a $1,000 cat.
So let's talk, because we're mentioning oxygen sensors right now. Let's actually talk about some of the fuel trim items. Like that's obviously the job of the oxygen sensor is kind of looking at figuring out exactly what to tell the computer, get the computer to chuck fuel in there. I think fuel trims are super important to check.
Absolutely. It tells you the health of your oxygen sensor. It'll let you know if your oxygen sensor is reading properly. And it'll give you a whole slew of other issues that could be happening that you may not know unless you're looking at the fuel trims.
Yeah, I agree. And coming back to we talked briefly there for like when you have that car that comes in with just the converter efficiency code. Oftentimes, those fuel trims are going to tell you the story that the other codes might not be telling you, right? So if you see a short-term or a long-term number that's looking real wonky, that's going to help you start checking some stuff out. So numbers wise, where do you like to see?
So it depends on the manufacturer. Obviously, whenever you're doing this, you want to look at All Data or ProDemand or whatever software that you use. But usually around 5 to 10% plus or minus is going to be problematic.
Right, you're talking on the short term.
On the short term side, exactly.
Long term, I think the numbers are a little fuzzier, right? Like they're much fuzzier, really. I mean, sometimes those numbers can get pretty wild, depending, to your point, on manufacturer. But I love the addition of the short term, looking at the short term stuff, because that can often tell a story. If you got long term numbers that look kind of good, but you got a short term number, it's the values are nuts, right? Plus 17% or something. You know that there's a recent problem that's causing this whole thing. It almost certainly means the converter probably has life left in it, right? It hasn't been operating in this environment for years and years and years on end. Instead, something recently went kerflooey on the car, and now it's making the converter act up.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily making the converter act up. It's just the computer thinks the converter is acting up because of, whether it's a vacuum
not cleaning
leak.
up all the fuel.
Yeah, exactly. It's overcompensating for some reason.
Which is also something worth probably talking about too. Like I tend to think, and my brain just biases this way, right? But like, oh, there's too much fuel in there, right? I'm going to see a positive short-term fuel trim. But as we talked about earlier, a big negative number can tell a story too, right? Like
Absolutely.
If the computer is consistently pulling fuel out, right? It's dialing off of the base map. You might be looking at sort of a problem that's existed for a long time, or there might be something like a leaky injector, right? Where you wouldn't expect that it would be going bad, but it's blowing extra fuel in there. Like so a negative number too can also cause that bad cat. And I think also, depending on how lean it's gotten, you've seen them things run hot. You got the glowing catalytic converter. That also can affect the job it's doing.
And there's a lot of causes for that. You could have a dirty mass airflow sensor. It could be a good mass airflow sensor, but it could be dirty and not giving a proper reading, proper airflow reading, which is going to either pull or add fuel when it's not needed.
Sometimes those things are all over the map. They go bad in the weirdest ways sometimes. Working fine one day and the next it's like totally shot and just acting up.
And a lot of times that could be because you're doing some type of repair and that mass airflow sensor was removed and could potentially have been dropped. Right. They're very sensitive to being dropped or knocked around. So if you had that removed and this is a new issue, that could be right where you need to go to.
Yeah. Now we're talking about all these short-term issues, right? That like anytime you see good long-term numbers, bad short-term, right? There's something just cropped up. But I think like bad long-term numbers, something that gets real weird there, can also tell you about a problem that's existed for a long time, right? Like how many times have you had somebody turn down a fuel filter
Yep,
replacement?
absolutely.
Boy, it's like pulling teeth sometimes to get people to do it. So like if you have a clogged fuel filter, that computer might be asking for more fuel than the pump is pushing. Similarly, you got a worn out fuel pump. The pump,
Yep.
the pump can't supply the pressure that this injector wants, so the injector winds up, needing a longer pulse width to make do with what it's got.
Could also be like an evap system leak, something that's been consistently happening, but people aren't going in and replacing those because they're not really a drivability concern. They're not going to cause a performance issue for the most part. So it could be, a leak that's been existing, adding fuel vapors into the intake and, causing a rich condition.
But one of the things we had chatted about was oxygen sensors, which might be one of the most important parts of these whole things. It's funny, like we think of it, we're talking about them now in terms of like a diagnostic item, but I would call them also a tune-up item too,
Yeah, oxygen sensors see extreme hot and cool down, so there's a lot of variations in temperature. Those heads can only take so much, and after a certain amount of time, even if they haven't completely failed, they could start reading incorrectly, even slightly, not enough to maybe trigger a check engine light or cause like an apparent failure or drivability issue, but it's going to reduce your fuel economy and performance of the vehicle. And you may not notice it because it's gradual, but it's something that if you're replacing the CAT, you should replace your O2 sensors as a preventative maintenance and get your car running 100%.
And moving back to what I was talking about too with those sensors that read super slow, in those cases, I've had customers come back and the increase in fuel mileage that they receive is often enough to like offset partially or fully the cost of this oxygen sensor replacement. Especially too, if you're replacing a catalytic converter, let's be honest, these are not cheap items to put onto a car. I would encourage all of you who are writing service and those of you who are wrenching, try and get that customer to spring for some fresh oxygen sensors in there. Like, you're not going to put new piston rings on an old piston when you're rebuilding an engine. Like, well, this just seems like the weirdest place to try and save a buck. I think sometimes people forget, right? We think of things in binary terms, right? It's not setting a code, so it must be fine.
Right.
And the reality is that oxygen sensors, much like spark plugs, which operate in a pretty similar environment, they kind of degrade gracefully over time, right? Like it's not usually one day you just wake up and an oxygen sensor is suddenly bad. Sometimes you'll get an oxygen sensor that is reading so slow, that computer is just dumping fuel into the car left and right. And once you actually get the fresh sensors in there, you clean up your 420 code, you're now saving some money on fuel. Customers are gonna notice much better fuel mileage. It's a repair that kind of makes a ton of sense. And if you just stabbed a cat in it, like the computer told you to do, you might not actually fix the car.
Unfortunately, for a lot of customers, they're looking at that bottom line and they don't consider that fuel economy savings because it's so gradual, but they look at that $400 additional bill when they should be looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah, and maybe this is something too, for those of you who are out there writing service, this might be something to think about as well, where you can kind of explain to your customer, look, putting in a couple $100 worth of oxygen sensors now might prevent you from this several $1,000 catalytic converter repair. I mean, you've seen the cost of some of these converters.
Yeah.
They're just sky high.
Absolutely.
It's kind of a bummer to think that a couple $100 in oxygen sensors might have prevented some of these repairs for people.
Yeah, a good technician that reads those numbers and reads those PID values are going to see a sensor that's not responsive and they're going to recommend to replace it, even if it's not triggering a code. So a lot of people that are just waiting for the code to trigger to tell them what they need to replace, those are the guys that are not going to be making those recommendations, and they're obviously not the techs that you really want working on your vehicle. I think we covered everything. I mean, the last piece that's really important is if you do replace your cat because you think it was bad and you went ahead and did it and you still have the same problem, it probably wasn't your cat. You don't want to necessarily replace that thing under warranty because you need to actually get your technician, or you as a technician, dig a little deeper and find the actual root cause.
I've probably done this before. I've put a cat in and not chased down another code. I'm not proud of that, so mea culpa. But I think it is important to realize too that the cat might not fix that 420 code if you've got something else going on there. And it's okay to, obviously it's not ideal, but if you misdiagnosed it the first time, it's okay to go back and do a little bit more diagnosis. Instead
of immediately assuming that the part that you got was failed.
Yeah, nobody loves a comeback, but my work is suspect before I suspect a bad part. Yeah, it's a great point. I think we may have done this one to death. Thanks for checking out this video on converters. This is Nick, I'm Lem, we're with Dorman, we're out of here.